Sometime around the year 30, in the city of Jerusalem, Jesus was executed by crucifixion, a terrible form of punishment that was characteristic of Roman Empire. It was one of the ways that the Romans exerted their power over, in particular, non-citizens, those whom they'd conquered, those who were enemies of the state, even slaves. As a non-citizen, Jesus lacked the civil rights that, for instance, the Apostle Paul, the greatest of the Christian missionaries, was able to exercise in order to transfer his case to a Roman jurisdiction. The story of Jesus is part of the history of the Roman Empire, and the teachings of Jesus, which would become the core of a new ethical outlook at the center of what would become the world's most prominent religion, are part of the story of law and justice. Over the next several lessons, we'll explore the philosophy of Jesus as a theorist of justice and try to assess how the teachings of Jesus and the Christians who followed him were different from the ideas of the Greeks and the Romans who surrounded them in the world of the Roman Empire. This will help us begin to assess what contribution Christianity made to the history of thinking about justice. Now, to turn to the teachings of Jesus, we rely on the four canonical Gospels, our most important sources for the life and message of Jesus. The four Gospels that are in the Christian Bible, that are regarded by the Christian church as authoritative: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Three of those Gospels are called the Synoptics: Mark, Matthew, and John. They're closely related, meaning that they can be seen together. That's what synoptic means. We'll look at the Gospel of Luke and its particular importance, its particular message, which has fundamental significance for the history of justice. But to understand the teachings of Jesus, we should start in the Gospel of Matthew, in particular, in one of the most famous, certainly the most influential passages of the Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. This passage in the Gospel of Matthew preserves in a more powerful and in a more compact way the essentials of the teachings of Jesus. And to understand the significance of Jesus' teaching for the history of justice, we can identify three core concepts, three core teachings that would forever impact the history of law and justice. One is the idea that righteousness is the purpose of life. Two, the idea that all human beings have fundamental dignity. And three, the idea of universalism, the idea that there is a kind of moral commitment that transcends all allegiances of family, of country, of tribe, of nation, even of empire. And so we want to think about these three concepts of Jesus' teaching: righteousness as the end of life, dignity as a fundamental attribute of every human, and universalism as a form of moral commitment, and to compare these with the ideas of justice that we've been exploring in the Greek and Roman context. And in particular, we'll compare these Christian ideas with some of the political concepts of Stoicism, the most important of the philosophies under the Roman Empire, and in some ways, the philosophy that shares most with the moral teachings of Christianity. But at the same time, we want to ask what is similar as well as what is different between Stoicism and Christianity. And so, to begin exploring the teachings of Jesus as a theory of justice, read the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes, a section of teachings that are called the Beatitudes. This comes from the Latin, beatus. It means blessed, blessed. And these are the lines in which Jesus identifies those who are blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. This is an extraordinary way to begin a passage of ethical teaching. And in fact, when you consider these Beatitudes, the proper way to consider their radicalism is to compare them to the way we've encountered Aristotle and Cicero's social thought. As you read what Jesus says, ask if you could imagine Aristotle or Cicero saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek," and so on. The Beatitudes begin the passage of the Sermon on the Mount precisely because, with these short, simple claims, Jesus announces that he is teaching a kind of social valuation that fundamentally overturns the values of this society. Jesus says those who are traditionally devalued in this society, who are denied certain kinds of dignity, are precisely those whom God will bless. And so the Sermon on the Mount begins by scrambling, by trying to destabilize your ordinary assumptions about what it means to be blessed. Anybody in this world would think to be blessed means to be rich, means to be powerful, means to be honored. Jesus says precisely it's those who lack wealth, those who lack traditional social honor, who are blessed. And so he begins this teaching about morality by destabilizing, by saying what society accepts as a sort of grid or scale of valuation is fundamentally wrong. So the Beatitudes encapsulate a kind of teaching about dignity that is inherent in the message of Jesus. And you see it throughout the rest of his ministry. If you read the Gospels, Jesus values children in a way that seems alien to classical culture. Jesus values the poor, the outcasts of society, in a way that is highly unfamiliar even to Greco-Roman philosophy. Secondly, the idea that righteousness is the purpose of life. Now, we've seen, going back to Aristotle, that considerations about the purpose of life, of what it means to be human, what is the end, the telos of being human, are fundamental to a conception not only of human nature, but also a theory of justice. It's impossible to begin to think about how do you give people what they are due without thinking about their worth and without thinking about their purpose. And so just as the Beatitudes begin the Sermon on the Mount by making certain kinds of claims about worth, so they continue by considering what is the purpose, what is the telos of being human. And Jesus is a theorist of the law. Jesus is learned in the Jewish law, and Judaism is a religion with, at the time of Jesus, an amazing tradition of thinking about law, about righteousness, about justice. And indeed, in Greek, those two words, justice and righteousness, are in fact the same word. And Jesus continues his ethical teaching in the Sermon on the Mount by reflecting on the nature of law and what it means to be a just person. He offers a series of what are called antitheses, thesis, antithesis. And he begins each of the antitheses by laying out some accepted aspect of the Jewish law. You've heard it said, do not commit murder. This is one of the fundamental Mosaic laws. Don't commit murder. Jesus says, but I say, so this is the antithesis, there's the thesis, and then Jesus' interpretation of it, but I say to you, whoever is even angry with someone has sinned. Jesus says, the law says, don't commit adultery. But I say to you, don't even look with lust, or else you have sinned. And so in each of these cases, Jesus takes an accepted part of the Jewish law and reinterprets it. And it's important, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, which presents Jesus as the final lawgiver, as the ultimate lawgiver of God, that Jesus comes to interpret, to offer a final revelation of the meaning of God's law. And in fact, in precisely this passage in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, I have not come to alter the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. And so he sees his teaching about the meaning of the law as the fulfillment, as the final teaching of the law. And notice what this implies. Jesus says that in each of these cases, don't murder, don't become angry, he offers fulfillment of the law by offering a more rigorous interpretation and an internalized interpretation. So on a day-to-day basis, it's generally easy not to kill people. Most days, it's easy not to commit murder. But not getting angry at someone is, in fact, a much more radical kind of command. Not to get angry at someone implies a kind of complete personal transformation internally that will guide you morally. And for Jesus, righteousness is the end of life. And righteousness requires this kind of internal motivation. It's an ethics that places complete emphasis on motivation over action. In fact, for Jesus, motivation is so fundamental that that is the sole criterion on which moral behavior is to be judged. And so he continues in the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, by giving advice about how to fast, how to give alms, and how to pray. And the essence of advice in all of these cases is to do it secretly, because then the motivation is purely out of righteousness, not out of the kind of honor that you might get by, for instance, giving wealth, or for being seen to be holy, to be seen praying, to be seen doing good things. Jesus says, do them secretly. Now, think about this in the context of the conversations that we've already had. This should in some ways remind you of the myth of the ring of Gyges that we explored in Plato's Republic. There, Glaucon says, would people be good if the consequences didn't matter? If there were some magic ring that allowed you to behave however you wanted, and no one would ever know, you would never get caught doing anything wrong, there would be no consequences, would you still behave justly? And Glaucon seems to think not, but Plato wants to find a moral system that is based on something internal. We could even say motivation. And there's something very similar, in a way, between this idea of Plato's Republic, that morality is internal transformation, is a harmony of the soul, and Jesus' teaching that morality is about internal transformation and motivations rather than consequences or outcomes. But you might also find differences between Plato's idea of what it means to be just, which is a highly rational, philosophical approach to life, and the teachings of Jesus, which is fundamentally spiritual and emphasizes instead love of others. And the Sermon on the Mount concludes with the idea that the highest teaching is complete love of God and love of others. And so we can ask, are there similarities and differences between Plato's vision of what it means to be righteous and that of Jesus? And what is the importance specifically of the love commands? Because love is not just a kind of rational outlook, but implies an internal transformation in which you can identify with other human beings as though they were even your own self.